Hi, my name is Dee Howe, and this is my 3-minute thesis. You arrive with a foldable shopping trolley in one hand, a Viet iced coffee in another. There are fruits here that you never really learnt of its name in English, but you sure recognize that familiar smell and how the ripened fruit feels to the palm of your hand. The floor here is slightly sticky, and a faint smell of durian constantly reminds you of where you are. It is always loud here. You pick up on that familiar Cantonese and many other languages not familiar to you. You step outside onto the main square. You have a favourite spot here. It's always in the afternoon sun and just far enough not to be deafened by a Vietnamese dance remix blasting from the street food stall, whose owner your uncle kind of knows. Welcome to Springvale. This is the case of my research, which aims to find out how the built elements of the urban environment can manifest a sense of place and identity for multicultural communities. Through interviews and fieldwork, I found that sense of place for migrant communities like Springvale are highly complex. There are transnational forces constantly shaping the urban environment. This is reflected in the types of groceries sold, the languages on the signs, and how the red plastic stools really remind you of Hanoi. It became clear that mundane activities, such as grocery shopping, eating, drinking, and casual hangouts, sense of place and place attachment is fundamentally rooted in these repeated activities. Over time, they reinforce a way of life which becomes familiar and embedded into the physical environment. It is the feelings of familiarity, comfort, and memory which enables a sense of place and identity to emerge. What stands out from my findings is a fundamental cultural difference in bodily experiences of place. Whilst Western cultures are adverse to experiencing outside odours and sounds, the smell of grilled meat, fish, seafood, and loud hawking are commonplace here in Springvale. Yet cultural norms are reflected in planning regulations and policies, and in our case, the cultural norms of Britain. The final takeaway here is that the sense of place and cultural identity cannot simply be designed into a place. It is emergent and develops over time as generations of communities mould physical spaces to their ways of life. The Victorian government's ambitious Activity Centres program envisions 16-storey towers rising over the streets of Springvale. But has the planning process considered the everyday routines of local residents? What about the markets, signages, open short storefronts, which are so important to the feelings of familiarity, attachment, and home? And as a nation which prides itself on multiculturalism, how can we ensure that cities can foster convivial and inclusive communities for generations to come? Thank you.
In his 2010 book, Cities for People, Jan Gale claims that decreasing walkability and active transport opportunities in cities across the world have contributed to the so-called obesity epidemic. He uses this photo, minus the caption, to emphasize his point. In contrast to the smiling, thin people moving their bodies in the pictures of the following pages, these people are faceless, anonymous, sedentary, and notably fat. They aren't people for us to identify with. They're off-putting, almost clinical presentations of a loathsome epidemic. For decades now, the fat activism movement has rallied against such deeply harmful imagery and language that depicts fatness as inherently unhealthy and fat people as in need of a cure. But despite often striving to support human health, urban planning, policy, and literature still frequently lean on poorly substantiated correlations to use fatness to indicate bad health as a result of bad planning. I conducted a systematic review of 67 published academic articles that drew a link between physical health and the built environment to find out whether urban planning literature over-focuses on fatness as an indicator of non-communicable disease. My review found that 78% of those papers referenced fatness at least once, most commonly to substantiate or give context to the issues being discussed. None of these papers discussed the systemic, pervasive stigma faced by so many fat people at the personal and institutional level, which studies show harms both mental and physical health. 45% of the papers I reviewed collected data on weight, with 33% in particular using body mass index, or BMI. But none discussed how poorly understood the causal links between fatness and health are, or that the BMI has been widely criticised in literature as a technically flawed and deeply stigmatising health indicator. And despite the fact that 46% of these studies concluded by explicitly linking weight to the built environment, none mentioned that medical research overwhelmingly shows the near impossibility of sustained, long-term weight loss for most individuals without continuous behavioural therapy, diet, exercise, and pharmacological or surgical intervention. In other words, parks and footpaths will not cure fat people. Urban planners can and should argue for the numerous benefits of interventions like open spaces, walkability, and active transport without using stigmatising, reductive, inaccurate indicators that are crude proxies for the things we actually care about, like physical activity levels and access to nutritious food. Further, by discussing fat people not as a disease, but as a unique demographic with specialised needs, we can make places that are healthier for everyone, because cities for people should include all people.
Imagine you love your neighborhood, the best cafe, your friends, place you call home. And suddenly there was this beautiful upscale park that built in your neighborhood. And one day, you are forced to leave because you can no longer afford the rent. This is often known as green gentrification, where the long-term residents were displaced by the greening development. In Brisbane, a conversion of a golf course into a public park added 3% to the property values. In Melbourne, the city of Maryback, installing a public playground added $20,000 for home located within 300 meters. This raises big questions. How can we deliver more green spaces without hijacking the property values? My research asked, to what extent can the community-led greening initiative help respond to the potential green gentrification? I study the community-led greening strategy across two Melbourne councils, Maryback and Darebin, the places that already experience gentrification pressures and part of the future home projects. I did the in-depth interview with the local residents, community leaders, and local councils to examine their motivation, action, process, outcome, enablers, and barriers they encounter. 3 important findings were described. First, the community-led greening initiative helps strengthen the social cohesion and flex-based identity. The shared stewardship, via relationship, local network, and creates sense of belonging, which fosters a stronger community resilience and collective capacity in responding to change. Second, it also contributed to the practical benefits such as food securities and climate response. However, the key challenge here is funding. Third, the community-led greening initiative unfortunately cannot solve the structural drivers of higher property values because negative gearing such as land banking that is done by developers and has been allowed by the government is a large-scale systematic forces that requires coordinated policy action. So going back to my opening statement, community-led greening initiative is not only valuable for the environmental outcomes, but it acts as a strong social strategy in reducing vulnerability to the higher property values. Therefore, it can only be a part of the urban greening agenda when the local action is matched with the policy safeguard to prevent greening development from gentrification.
Traffic congestion is a serious problem that costs Melbourne about $4.6 billion in losses annually. Subsequently, researchers have agreed that the only practical way to tackle this congestion problem is by resorting to demand-based strategies. A traffic congestion charge is one of such strategies that has received mixed responses globally in terms of its adoption and acceptability. Therefore, my research asks the question, how would a hypothetical traffic congestion charge in the Melbourne CBD affect commuters' travel behaviors? To answer this question, I use two phases in my methodology. In the first phase, I made use of the latest Vista dataset. By using PSQL language queries, I filtered out data to extract specific Melbourne-bound trips originating from various LGAs across the metropolitan region and then spatially distributed them by making maps on ArcGIS. This phase led me to the conclusion that Melbourne at the moment is facing unevenly distributed car dependency issues. In my second phase, I made use of a travel choice survey which garnered 115 responses. The travel choice survey asked respondents about their general attitudes towards the congestion pricing scheme and whether they would change their travel behavior in response to it based on a 5-point Likert scale questionnaire. The results were then analyzed into 3 sections: descriptive statistical analysis, correlational analysis, and cross-tabulation. The key findings from this phase was that even though there was moderate support towards the congestion pricing scheme, that did not necessarily translate into actual travel behavior changes. This was also supported by my correlational analysis, which found no significance between those two variables. Furthermore, cross-tabulation revealed that only 33% of respondents who travel into the city by car said that they would be considering changing their mode of travel to public transport or something alternative, and a further 38% who frequently travel into the city said that they would consider trip chaining or reducing their trips altogether, whilst a large portion remained uncertain or opposing towards the scheme. Finally, a constantly recurring theme throughout the survey was that the current state of public transport was not sufficient and it needed to be more reliable, have better coverage, cost-friendlier, and frequent. In conclusion, an isolated CBD-based congestion charge is not sufficient to anticipate travel behavior changes, and a more holistic network-wide approach is necessary. However, my research was successful in giving reasons to why the respondents are hesitating towards changing their travel behaviors, and it all comes down to the inadequate public transport infrastructure and equity concerns. Thank you.
In Melbourne, 35% of first mile or station access trips are made by car, and less than 1% by bike. A bike can offer the same door-to-door flexibility as a car, within a comparable time frame over short distances and without the negative environmental and health impacts. So, why do so few people cycle to the station? To address this question, I used surveys and semi-structured interviews with people who ride and people who drive to the station to answer two questions. The first was, what do first mile drivers perceive as barriers to cycling to the station? And the second, how do these perceptions compare with the experiences of first mile riders? And I found three pretty interesting things. The first was that the barriers reported by drivers were numerous, diverse, and pretty consistent with the literature, and riders generally weren't deterred by the barriers that drivers mentioned. For example, drivers were more likely to perceive the car as necessary for things like carrying their work stuff to the station or dropping their kids off somewhere on the way to the station, and less likely to perceive that you can cycle to the station in your everyday clothes and shoes. The second thing was that time was the most commonly reported barrier for drivers, and they were pretty keen on shaving even just a minute or two off their commute. But interestingly, they often overestimated how long it took to cycle to the station. And the final finding, which I think is probably the most interesting, is that people's perceptions of cycling safety, infrastructure quality, and bike parking security actually didn't impact their mode choice that much. Mode choice generally reflected people's default travel habits, and for drivers, shifting this habit for just one transport task was just too much of an effort, too much time, and too much money to do so. So, what does this all mean? If we want to encourage modal shift for the first mile, there's two things that we can do. First, planners and policymakers should encourage built environment interventions that make riding a bike faster and more convenient than driving a car for all transport tasks. And secondly, these should be coupled with some experience or education programs to really challenge drivers' perceptions that a car is always faster, more practical and essential to do tasks where a bike would suffice. Thanks.
Melbourne is set to hit a staggering 9 million people by 2050. Outer suburbs and growth areas are amongst the fastest growing in terms of population. This growth is facilitated by the VPA, who creates master plan estates called precinct structure plans. But this development pattern has also been criticized for its limited and standardized housing, as well as insufficient urban infrastructure. The other factor to consider is that Melbourne's suburbs are diversifying, with 40% of people in growth areas born overseas. Proactively planning for the future means recognizing this growth and diversity, as well as the diverse needs of multicultural communities. Therefore, my research explores the homemaking practices of Filipino first home buyers in Melbourne's outer growth areas, focusing on how residents use, adapt, and reappropriate housing to suit their daily and cultural needs. Unlike established migrants who formed ethnic enclaves, Filipino settlement patterns are dispersed across growth areas. There is a gap in understanding how newer migrant groups navigate a sense of place and belonging in contemporary suburban developments. Using a qualitative approach, I conducted interviews and photo elicitation with 11 first home buyers who have bought properties in outer growth areas in the last 10 years. They also shared photographs and floor plans to demonstrate how they adapted their homes and to show what spaces mattered to them. Overall, amidst discourse about suburban sprawl, unaffordable housing, and migrants blamed for the housing shortage, it is important to shed light upon the lived experiences of those who decide to call Australia their home. Practices of housing adaptation and reappropriation can be seen as a critique to the homogeneous development that permeate modern suburbia. And in planning for a city's growth and diversity, it is crucial that planners, designers, and developers ask the bigger question: who are we planning for? And consider how culture-sensitive design can help inform housing, subdivision, and suburb design to create communities that is reflective of those living there. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my research is about parks in Melbourne. But don't worry, I'm not here to tell you parks are good. We all know about that. If parks are bad, the government is never put it in everywhere. My real question is can everyone in Melbourne easily go to the parks? Melbourne is called one of the most livable cities in the world. When we hear livable, we may imagine sunshine, coffee, green grass, and people jogging with their dogs. Very Melbourne. But there is the problem. This nice lifestyle may not seem for everyone. For example, imagine one student live in Torak. They just open the door, go to walk a few minutes, and there may be a nice green space nearby. Very peaceful, very calm, very I drink all the nothing. Now imagine another student live in Footscray. They also want to go to the park. But maybe they need to cross a very long road, walk around industry zone, or follow a road that it sounds like, am I going to the park, or I just finished assignment for urban planning? So in my study, I just use one simple rule, 800 meters. This is about almost the 10 to 20 minutes walk. If people live in 800 meters of a public open space, I counted that as good access. Then I use GIS mapping to check different areas across Greater Melbourne. I also use a socioeconomic index called IISAD. In simple words, I want to know, do you know advantage area has better access to the park? My result is yes, but only a little. When I look at that area, advantage area has slightly better park coverage, but the link was weak. When I look at the people where people live, the link was not clear. So the story is not simple. It's not like Torak has all the trees, the Footscray have none. Cities has more complicated than that. My main message is this: a livable city is not just about having one green color on the map. We need to ask, who can actually walk to the park? Is the route easy? Is the park useful? Because Melbourne should just look green. It should feel green for everyone living here.